Yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for joining in, and good evening. So, this is the sixth webinar of Delhi Comparatives series of webinars organized by COVID-19 Research and Archiving Forum. And before we delve into uh, the experts, like research, analysis, etc., I give a brief about what is Delhi Comparatives and what is this forum really doing. So, Delhi Comparatives is an academic group that was initiated by teachers and students of University of Delhi 10 years ago. And this group aims to study the Indian literary scenario through the prism of, say, transmediality and interdisciplinarity. The core focus of this group is to develop a critical understanding of the social and political dynamics of the multicultural Indian landscape. And our various events, research projects, and collaborations embrace themes like comparative studies, literary historiography, transmediality, pluralistic epistemology, marginocentrism, spatiality, digital humanities, etc. And we endeavor to create a sustainable, socially relevant hub under the esteemed guidance and with the core vision of Professor Satyanath and Dr. Chakrabarti. And the intent is to engage with these enhance the tools, methodology, theory, and approaches pertaining to these dynamically interactive areas of study. And keeping intact this vision, the intent, the COVID-19 Research and Archiving Forum of Delhi Comparatives was formed in order to look into the cultural studies and the cultural shifts that have occurred as a consequence of the pandemic. And the project COVID-19 in India, hence the Culture Responses Project, came into being as a collaboration between Delhi Comparatives Delhi and Tokyo University of Foreign Studies, Japan. This made us research, rethink, relook, and archive the cultural responses. And our intent was to adopt a multidisciplinarity approach, methodology in terms of our primary data and other approaches. And so far, we have delved into sociological research and cultural studies to understand the intricacies of the responses. And the idea of the project is to understand how the economical, educational, geopolitical, sociological changes have instigated a new cultural schema, reality, and language. And moreover, our project intends to see how these changes have introduced a different, sudden, inadvertent relationship and experience altogether that is persisting and may persist post COVID. So, yeah, this is about our intent, our objective, and hopefully we'll be able to uh, fulfill it with your expertise and with the help of the experts we have been engaging with so far. So, yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Anhiti, for joining our webinar today. Over to you, Dr. Dhurjyoti.
Okay, thank you, Saheb, and a very good evening to all of you. I guess we should start with the proceedings straight away. So it's my pleasure and privilege to already Saheb has given the welcome note to once again welcome Dr. Anhiti Patnaik to this lecture, the sixth webinar on COVID-19 cultural responses. And she will be speaking on productivity to precarity, rethinking social media, feminism in COVID times. So, as is the protocol, I'd like to say a few lines about Dr. Anhiti Patnaik so that we get to know her better and so that also the discussion is carried forward. So Dr. Anhiti Patnaik is an assistant professor at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Birla Institute of Technology and Science, Pilani, Hyderabad campus, an Ontario Trillium Scholar. She completed her PhD at the Department of Cultural Studies, Trent University in Canada, and her areas of interest include creative writing, postmodernism, criminology, Victorian literature, and queer theory. She has been published in international journals like Bronte Studies, Neo-Victorian Studies, and Victorian Network. She is a fellow of the School of Criticism and Theory, Cornell University, and Institute of World Literature, Harvard University, and is a member of the Modern Language Association, MLA. So I once again welcome Dr. Patnaik to in our midst, and I guess we should not wait further, and we should get back straight into action. So may I request Dr. Patnaik to please begin her lecture. Over to you, Dr.
I hope I'm still audible. It's clear, the sound is clear.
Yeah, it's clear.
Okay. Thank you so much, Saheb and Durjati, for such kind introductions. First of all, I mean, the title doctor is really terrifying, particularly because we're in a pandemic. So you can just call me Anhiti, it's fine. I mean, I'm not an essential service provider at all. I mean, although the work that we're doing is really essential in its own way. So really, thank you so much for letting me be a part of this project, which, I mean, given the situation that we're in, I think that the work, this collaborative work is doing on, cultural responses to COVID-19, particularly from, the Indian perspective, from the Indian experience of this otherwise global crisis. It's really important, and I hope that the talk I give today will give us some sort of terminology to think about the experience we're all in from a cultural studies point of view. And it's a real privilege to be part of it. So thank you. Let me quickly share my slides, and you can let me know if there's any issues. So are the slides visible, Saheb? Like, is it full screen? You can see?
Yes,
Okay.
they are. Yes, they are. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, great. So very, very quickly, I mean, my talk is titled Productivity to Precarity, both of which are terms that are new to my research interests. And I'm trying to think about the role of social media, particularly in terms of activism, and how that is a very important cultural response, something that requires archiving, something that requires interpretation, because it's located so deeply in the moments that we're in. So I'll be trying to rethink social media feminism in COVID times, and the case studies I'll bring up from India as well as diasporic Indians living abroad. And so basically my talk has three sections. In the first part, I will try to define a term that I'm borrowing from cultural studies, theories on disability, for instance. It's called bio-precarity. And I'm borrowing that term to contextualize our lived experience of COVID-19 in neoliberal India. After that, I'll be employing what is called a crip queer approach. Again, a term coming out of disability studies, cultural studies. And I'll be using that approach to do a differential analysis of these two terms, productivity and precarity, during the pandemic. And finally, if we have some time, I'll go through some case studies on Instagram where, whether you're trending or whether you're being trolled become two sides of the same coin, particularly for a non-normative subject or a non-normative person. So I'll be, in the first part, just to take you guys through the structure of the lecture today, I'll be looking at four sort of, ways in which this bio-precarity gets produced through ableist and patriarchal and neoliberal and neocolonial discourses in contemporary India. And in order to do that, I'll be drawing on theories from Judith Butler, and following Judith Butler, another very important theorist, Margaret Shildrick, who has done a lot of work on disability studies and on crip queer theory. And finally, these are some of the case studies that we can discuss towards the end. Those of you who are online, you may already be familiar with some of these users on Instagram. So I'll take you through some of these case studies, and we can look at what kind of digital feminism is going on here and how it's responding to, the particular experience of living in a pandemic as a non-normative subject. So most of us with whatever sort of background that we have in theory, in critical theory or in cultural studies or even in gender studies, most of us are somewhat familiar with Judith Butler's theory of gender performativity, right? But I'm drawing on this essay. I've mentioned the source right here, Performativity and Precarity. In this essay, it's a fairly recent essay where Butler is pushing her definition of gender performativity a bit in the direction of what she calls precarity. And, she's basically using the lens of gender or expanding the lens of gender here to refer to communities and groups that are exposed to trauma, physical and symbolic violence, and vulnerability and displacement on a day-to-day basis from multiple different angles of their identity rather than just gender, especially in a nation state that is undergoing crisis, right? Like a war or economic crash or a pandemic. And, she basically states that performativity was, to be sure, an account of agency, and precarity seems to focus on conditions that threaten life in ways that appear to be outside one's control. Anything living can, of course, be expunged at will or by accident, and it is in no sense guaranteed. As a result, social and political institutions, of course, exist. They are designed to minimize conditions of precarity, especially within the nation state. But as she writes the essay, Butler discovers that precarity actually is a politically induced condition. It's not something inherent, something we're born with, something we can fix by individual choice. It designates a politically induced situation or condition or identity where certain parts of the population, certain groups, certain communities suffer from failing social and economic networks of support, and they become differentially exposed to injury, violence, and death, as we've been seeing during the pandemic in India. And such populations are therefore at heightened risk compared to normative subjects, heightened risk to disease, poverty, starvation, displacement, and violence, right? So if you just want to kind of summarize Butler's idea of precarity, she's defining it as a politically induced condition of maximized vulnerability, something that is obviously artificial, but sort of posed or kind of understood in culture as something that is intrinsic or something that is a personal choice, right? But I'm choosing to follow Butler in thinking of precarity as an ideologically produced state, not something that we are born into. So using Butler, I've kind of tried to create a kind of model here, a productivity scale, because this is a word that we heard a lot, in the early days of lockdown. How are we being productive while working from home or staying at home? So this scale, of being productive during COVID-19 self-isolation, social isolation, and distancing. I'm using Butler's concept of precarity to indicate how the concept of productivity obviously is neoliberal. It's not something that is natural. It's not something that we can just assume without questioning. It's a cultural myth that we are all acutely aware of. We even perform it, particularly on social media, where we report about our day-to-day lives. It's something we perform in Butlerian kind of ways, right? It's something performed. And therefore, in order to be deemed productive, at least three of these four forms of cultural capital, I think, are required in order to be productive or appear productive or be perceived as being productive during a pandemic where we all have to work from home. First of all, technological capital, right? I mean, in fact, this very seminar is taking place via Zoom. It's taking place on our laptops. It's taking place because we have a very good Wi-Fi bandwidth, etc. We need some technological capital in order to just conduct our day-to-day affairs. Smartphones, chargers. Again, chargers are not something we think about, but chargers are really important. So obviously a charger means that this is a gadget that you own rather than something you've borrowed from a parent or a peer or friend or even rented, right? Wi-Fi, a laptop, computer, headphones, a pulse oximeter. You need all kinds of technology at your disposal just for basic day-to-day functioning that obviously a large part of our population can't access. And I'll be doing some case studies and examples about what happens when you are obviously lacking this technological capital. You will be classified as poor, where previously you would not be classified as poor because you were above the poverty line. Then you need, even if you possess this technological capital, what's interesting is you need the additional visual and auditory abilities to be able to use this technology, right? So in order to be able to use this technology productively, you need to be able to read, you need to be able to hear, you need to be able to speak, particularly because we have become absent presences now as subjects. Our physical bodies are absent from our day-to-day interactions. So for instance, you need captions on Zoom meetings and on Google Meet lectures or webinars or meetings so that people who are auditorily impaired, for instance, or challenged can at least read the subtitles. You might even want to use text-to-speech, speech-to-text software. We have touchscreen phones, but it's interesting how you don't have Braille touchscreen, for instance, for visually challenged people. So even if you have access to this technological capital, you will not be able to be productive in this neoliberal kind of way, and you will probably fall under this category that I'm calling CRIP, right? Taking the term from CRIP, queer. And it's a correlative to the term queer, the way queer gets used in cultural studies. It's a term that has been reclaimed by disability studies. Then, of course, even if you check off these two boxes, which some of us do, there is a great degree of conformity required when you're being productive, right? So how are we being productive on social media particularly? It's through cooking, right? It's through all these traditionally female-dominated domestic chores because we are all trapped at home. So cooking, arts and crafts, cleaning, so lots of tutorials on how to clean, right? Makeup tutorials, recycling, gardening, weight loss and nutrition, mindfulness, wellness, everything that has traditionally been a female-dominated cultural domain in middle class and neoliberal India. So if you do fall in the queer or the non-normative sexual identity category where you don't have the stability or the perceived stability of institutions like a home and marriage and children, then obviously all these activities, even if they are being performed, they are not deemed productive or legitimate in the same kind of way. And lastly, something that we don't think about much, the fact that this webinar is even being conducted in English, although it's not the first language of any of the participants who are probably online. English, of course, is the language of hegemony, and it's a way in which many non-white or non-colonially hegemonized populations, they will be disadvantaged or disenfranchised if they do not conduct this day-to-day interaction, whether it's in their career, whether it's through social media, through the hegemonic language of English, right? So your digital literacy pretty much depends on awareness and comfort with speaking and writing and reading English. Now, if you combine them together, you get productivity. But if even one of them sort of falls out of the pie chart, of this relationship, then you are kind of falling a bit below the scale of productivity, especially during this pandemic. Now, obviously, these differences have existed. It's not like they are differences that have been created particularly through the pandemic. But what's interesting about the pandemic is that it has kind of made these differences obvious. And it has made these differences or these disadvantages universal, far more universal than they were before, right? So you may be poor or crip or queer or non-white in a far more disadvantaged way than you were before when everything was not in a work from home or in a digital kind of platform, right? So moving on to neoliberalism, what exactly does that mean and how does it really impact, right? I mean, this interface between neoliberalism and precarity, it's really unavoidable right now because this pandemic is precisely a kind of embodiment of precarity in the context of global neoliberalism. And it's exposed, how neoliberalism affects us in the starkest of possible terms, right? So let me just give you a quick example. Many of us are, in education, whether we are instructors or whether we are students. And this educational apparatus in India is very complicated because it runs a lot on, reservations. It runs a lot on scholarships. It runs a lot on welfare, on subsidized tuition, compared with education in many other developed countries, without compromising the quality of education, of course. So this means that students who previously possessed cultural capital based on their merit, right, this neoliberal myth of merit, now even with the merit, they are precarious. So we've seen so many examples when these universities and colleges and high schools were forced to move online or to remote learning. This lack of technology and certain technological resources, or the ability to use technology, and I'm using ability, thinking in disability studies terms, not something that we treat commonsensically. This obviously, coupled with lots of institutional chaos and negligence that we've all experienced over the last couple of months, it has unfortunately, but unsurprisingly, led to an increase in deaths by suicide among young students, right? So we have many cases. For instance, in London, UCL and University of Sussex and Imperial College found that 10% of the respondents of a survey that they recently conducted reported suicidal ideation or thoughts of hurting themselves in some way. And this is not normally, what I'm trying to say is, these student populations we would normally consider to be privileged and able and productive, right? So now they've fallen into the category of precarious. Then in America, you have Center for Disease Control and Prevention that found 40% teenagers actually experiencing mental or behavioral challenges tied to studying at home, because they may not have a nurturing environment. They may not have their own homes, especially children of immigrant families. And India, of course, has seen a lot of cases that were there in the news that it's important to acknowledge. June 18th, there were 2 Dalit girls who took their lives in Kerala. June 20, there was a 16-year-old girl in, I think, Bengal. September 3rd, Tamil Nadu's Teni and Uludurpet districts witnessed 2 cases of death by suicide. And they're all extremely everyday struggles, so it's not how we normally consider suicide to be this really deep existential thing. It's just the lack of technological resources. They faced chronic power cuts. They couldn't afford Wi-Fi bills. They didn't have dedicated devices to do their studies. They were scared of failing online exams because of power cuts. Right? So it's very ordinary, everyday realities. And then, of course, a case that's extremely close home is Aishwarya Reddy, right? Who, again, died by suicide very recently. She was an LSR student because she couldn't afford to live outside the hostel, and her scholarship was also being revoked. And everything, when it goes online, obviously, the whole system goes into chaos, and these expectations of remaining productive become the privilege of a tiny population compared to the privilege of a slightly larger population as before, right? So in her case, what's interesting is, yes, this was 2nd November, right? In her case, what's interesting is that her death kind of brought about this very acute awareness on social media that these are not isolated incidents, and they are not something that will go away with the pandemic. They are not something that is necessarily situated with what's going on a month-to-month basis in terms of this global health crisis. This obviously reveals certain, neoliberal biases or neoliberal expectations that our, state-owned institutions have, despite being state-owned, on students who were not previously precarious, who are now being thrust into precarity, right? So it's shown how in neoliberal global culture, this self-worth and fulfillment and who you are, it's really fundamentally connected to myths of ability, productivity, merit, and a kind of free market competition. But obviously, you've had a lot of backlash against this. The Women Development Cell at LSR, created a new hashtag, which was Justice for Aishwarya. They had lots of sort of protests online. They created posters. They created awareness. And then there have been sort of some pressure that has been put on these neoliberal educational institutions to reorient the way they educate rather than who they educate, right? Or who they choose to educate and who they choose not to educate. so this is one example where you can see how all of us, of course, are vulnerable to, physical, bodily, or mental breakdown due to the risk of unexpected change or accident or disease, or simply just the process of aging, right? The inevitable falling away of normative standards of mental and physical capacities that we have associated with aging. But it really proves the point that the individual in neoliberal culture is always already temporarily disabled, right? Or able disabled. So we don't really have this separation or this binary between people who are not precarious and people who are precarious in that traditional kind of sense, right? It speaks to a certain commonality, where it's children or it's populations that have been recently made precarious who weren't previously, right? And when we think about COVID-19 and the death rates of particularly of those who are obliged to continue working, recently underprivileged female or lower caste students in India, it becomes, their bodies, these dead bodies that we hear about, it becomes metonymic of our pain and suffering, as well as that of healthcare workers, refuse collectors, bus drivers, street cleaners, protesting farmers, everybody who is providing an essential service and cannot opt out of their day-to-day economic activities or their cultural activities because there's a pandemic, right? So this stress of being, or at least remaining productive in a moment of crisis without recognizing what the crisis is doing on a case-to-case basis, right? And that it's leaving certain communities at higher risk than others. It's predicated on this concept of a slow death, where it's not a death as a crisis or exception, but it's just symptoms of relentless burden, of precarity within neoliberal cultures, where it's slow, but it's defined and it's inevitable, just like a parasite, will attack its host. Moving on, I wanted to talk about the work ethic idea and how it's attached to being productive. This slow death, that's normally imposed on oppressed or marginalized or precarious communities, it sustains this wealth of the state in a neoliberal kind of culture, both in the global north and global south. The term, of course, is used to describe, state policies in the global north for several decades, with the Indian state, of course, embracing neoliberal ideologies when we privatized in the early 90s. It refers not just to, a free market kind of concept in terms of policies where privileged private operators will kind of run state-run, welfare-run enterprises, but it's the downgrading of any government regulations, right? Where government has to protect precisely those who are either precarious or being made precarious by a certain condition, right? So workers, women, elderly, disabled, right? Against this pursuit of, or this blind pursuit of unfettered profit. So what's interesting to me is that I think that in India, particularly with the pandemic, these colonially inherited variations of a Protestant work ethic that normally functions in places like America or Britain, in the West, it's begun to kind of distill itself in our society as well. And I'm borrowing the phrase, of course, from Max Weber's work on, the Protestant work ethic, Protestant ethic of capitalism. And Weber, of course, argued that it's linked to this Protestant ideal of duty, where there's a social or an ethical compulsion to work or to keep working even in crisis. There's a stoicism, right, that's attached to work, to producing endlessly even in times of crisis, to not grieve or mourn or care for the self, but for the greater good in that sense, right? And it's, of course, its origins are in Calvinism, but because we have such an interesting history of being colonized, I feel like there is a kind of how shall I put it, a post-Protestant or a neo-Protestant or a residual Protestant work ethic that has really come up in social media in terms of remaining productive, appearing productive, even as we are in a condition of crisis, right? It's a kind of asceticism attached to work, And it's very interesting how it's again a psychological state, one that requires perception of productivity or a paranoia around productivity, where every nanosecond of our life, where we can't even go for a walk without having our headphones on, listening to a podcast, for instance, where you're multitasking. So all these concepts, where every moment of your life needs to count as doing something, because it's only by doing that your identity gets created. So it's a weird mix, of these colonially inherited or residual notions of a Protestant work ethic, combined with, of course, ideas of karma that our Hindu sort of government, our predominantly Hindutva government is perpetuating, right? That you are what you do, and we don't stop doing just because, things have changed. So this failure to do, or this being exposed to risk, becomes a personal choice. It becomes a personal problem rather than the responsibility of the state and the community, right? Because neoliberalism will always focus on individual enterprise, individual choice, rather than collective action or what the state needs to do. So it's very interesting to see, and very important to see, how social media feminists have actually pushed against these neoliberal ideas of productivity coming through these Protestant notions of the work ethic. So there are some very interesting illustrations and cartoons that came out of the early days of lockdown. This one, as you can see, refers to the migration of daily wage laborers and workers, when there was the migration crisis in our country in the summer, when lockdown was first announced. So you can see that obviously these workers are just being corralled in public transport, like animals. And you can see that the driver is shouting at the parent, ask the child to show some self-reliance, right? So again, it's a parody, of course, of, Atmanirbharta, right? This kind of myth that's been created, this cultural myth or this cultural ideal that's been created by our government, because it follows a neoliberal kind of policy where the onus is not on the government to, of course, provide welfare and rehabilitation and homes and alternative jobs to these recently precarious or recently disenfranchised parts of our population, who were always already, of course, on the margins of society or the borders. It creates this kind of burden of self-reliance, right? It's again part of the slow death, where this is where you're headed and it's your journey, it's not our business. So the Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan, for instance, right, promotes self-reliance in a very, very Weberian kind of way, which I found really interesting. Of course, mixed with karma, mixed with senses, these sense of duty, and duty being attached to. So it's our duty to be healthy, right? It's our duty rather than the state's duty to keep us healthy, to provide us with essential free services like Wi-Fi, for instance, right? If we're moving digital. So again, these are very interesting sort of representations coming out in popular culture and the media, where the state perpetuates these residual colonial ideas of a work ethic in its campaign of self-reliance, right? So moving on, I thought it might be useful at this stage to introduce yet another variation on the term precarity that comes from Margaret Shildrick's work, Bioprecarity in Neoliberal Times, which was a lecture that she did for us at BITS very recently on 21st, where she was talking about the pandemic. So we had the opportunity to engage with her, which was really nice. And she's, of course, adapting Butler's term and adding the term bio in front of precarity to relate to this very material and ontological effects of lived experience. So precarity isn't just something you feel, or it isn't a perception. It's actually material. It's rooted in your reality within liberalism, within neoliberal cultures. So whether you are unemployed or illiterate or non-male or poor or disabled or low caste, you are suffering the worst form of oppression and disenfranchisement and precarity. And the pandemic has revealed actually that it's not just a small part or even a kind of pre-existing part of our culture, or our society that's suffering, but that very few of us actually escape all these parameters, right? And it's degrees and layers of privilege, degrees and layers of abilities that allow us to remain productive rather than precarious. So she talks about how debility becomes, debility, of course, is a theoretical term for what we think of as being disability. It becomes a kind of embodied precarity, which stresses how neoliberal politics targets certain bodies and identities, and their precarity increases in moments of crisis, right? So let's think about women. Let's think about patriarchy and how there is this kind of neoliberal, and how neoliberal politics actually very silently, invisibly attacks the woman's body, especially during pandemic. Conventionally, of course, when we think about precarity and debility or disability, we really tend to think of people who are a small population, who are marginalized, who are weakened by disease or illness, whether it's mental or physical illness, overexertion or disability. But now in cultural studies, it's a far more broader term that encompasses how even in our ordinary lives, our lives are just persisting in this perpetually worn out state, right? A slow death, what the metaphor of the slow death, without ever the promise of getting better, right? So this includes not only people whose daily subsistence is materially precarious, but also physically and psychologically oppressed people. Like we sort of looked at the examples of students committing suicide, for instance, because of online learning. These lives would certainly not have been lost, if we hadn't so dramatically shifted to online learning with the assumption that many of us are productive and not precarious, or will be able to be productive. Now, I just wanted to focus on how middle-class Indian women have been rendered precarious due to the pandemic. And it's very interesting to see how, because work from home has not corresponded with a correlative distribution of domestic chores and domestic labor that traditionally women have and women do, do in even middle-class and even upper middle-class Indian families. You can see that, there has been a kind of multiplication of their hours of labor, right, without any reprieve. So there have been concrete sort of physical, impact that it's had on women's bodies. In fact, a very interesting survey which was part of the pandemic stress index in America, it looked at how 83 women across 6 countries developed irregular menstrual cycles during lockdown. And this is obviously because of a disturbance in their day-to-day lives, an increase in their physical labor and in their mental sort of anxiety and stress to keep everything going, particularly women who have children, women who are single parents, or women who are working at home along with being the primary caregivers, right? So, essential services as well, right? I mean, these were the few sort of areas that are actually female-dominated careers where they weren't allowed to work from home because they are essential services, right? So your caretakers, your nurses, your childcare workers or teachers, right? But employers are oblivious to the fact that their domestic situation has not changed. In fact, it's gotten worse because now they have to take care of the health of their own families as well in multiple different ways, right? So a condition that they are diagnosing as pre-TSD is very, very interesting. Pre-TSD, which is now a diagnosable sort of psychological condition like PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, which basically means that you feel stressed or anxious or numb, and there's a kind of detachment or derealization between your day-to-day life and your goals or your ambitions or your identity. And this is something a lot of working mothers and a lot of single mothers are experiencing, once you move to work from home environments. And of course, pre-TSD, one of its symptoms or its conditions can be the disturbance of your menstrual cycle as well. They also basically saw that this breadwinner homemaker model, right, where you're supposed to do both, it actually again dates back to the Industrial Revolution in 1960s in the West when women began to work, and it exacted a higher toll from women who not only did their day jobs, but were also expected to take the responsibilities of the home and household. But now, because traditional structures of patriarchy are still in place, right, where it is taboo for men to contribute to household work, or they have not been trained in it, or they are unable, again, they are unable, but they are not seen as to be disabled when you ask them to do household work, right? So on an average, rates of domestic violence and conflict have also increased in India because of this, because of increased pressure on women. And when it comes to female entrepreneurs, that's really interesting. Middle class and upper middle class female professionals and entrepreneurs, there has been the added stress of, converting all their productivity to something that is consumable in the media, right? So on Instagram or on their websites, right? So they feel a third and extra layer of what is called productivity anxiety, where it's not just about whether you're doing your job and taking care of your family, but it's also about the appearance of making a difference, making a contribution, creating live content, right? Commodifying or fetishizing or monetizing every single aspect, including your hobbies, right? So for instance, you might be sort of doing Zoom classes for cooking recipes or for embroidery or for all these other traditionally arts and crafts, right? Female dominated leisure activities are no longer leisure, but they are linked to your identity and to this myth of being productive, right? So lots of these, we've had lots of movements on social media that kind of try to amplify this myth of being productive by showing the strength of women who are multitasking, who are doing all this together. Obviously, it just increases your condition of precarity, this feeling of slow death, this feeling of derealization, rather than, making you really feel empowered, like you can see in this particular image, right? So, then, of course, productivity, it's a very, very ableist kind of concept. It's a very ableist myth. And by that, I mean, the way to be perceived as being productive on social media, and you had these a kind of explosion of these lists when lockdown was announced, right? What is called a listicle, basically like an article, but a list of how to be productive during the lockdown, how not to waste this time as if remaining at home in order to avoid catching a virus without a vaccine is time waste, right? It's wasted time, or the fact that we're never going to get this time back because we will go back to being hyper productive. So it's very interesting how all these lists, and this is just a representative example that I found, they rely on you being a certain kind of age, you having technological skills and access and ability to do all these things. It's obviously very gender centric. So pickling vegetables or cooking or painting your nails, doing nail art, pressing flowers, there is a gender emphasis to all this. You can see that even visually, this pink kind of motif means productivity is something oriented towards, women of a certain demographic, between the ages of, let's say, 18 to 40. Domestic comfort and security, resources, access to resources without having to step out. This is also something that is assumed. The fact that you may not have too many domestic or social burdens is assumed. So obviously someone who has children or aging parents to look at will not be able to be productive during the lockdown, right? So it's very, very interesting how there is a real cost in being productive. And that's something nobody talks about. It's an expectation that we all have on ourselves. It's an expectation society has of us. But during this period of uncertainty and grief and loss and anxiety, like so many of us have had close family relatives and friends who've been impacted by this disease in some way or the other, right? All that is pushed down or sublimated or repressed through this myth of productivity, which is an ableist myth, right? So everything on this list assumes you are mentally fit, you are physically fit, you are comfortable, you are secure, you are privileged, and you are probably a woman, right? Or identifying as female, right? You're certainly not what we think of as being disabled or precarious in any way. So this is how the body gets produced in a pandemic. This is how subject identities get produced in the pandemic as being valid, as being normal, as having capacity or ability, right? They are capacitated, whereas anybody who falls in this category and cannot do these things is incapacitated or is precarious, right? So escaping this slow death or appearing productive, it comes at a literal cost. And those who are unable are just marked as failures. They are marked as bad citizens or bad subjects, people who are almost treated immorally because they lack the work ethic. It is, after all, an ethic, right? It's an ethical way of being engaged, being productive, not being lost in yourself and wasting time, etc. So this approach that I'm taking to analyze our reality from a cultural point of view through this intersection between neoliberalism, ableism, patriarchy, and ability, It's a crip queer approach and crip queer theory. It's something new that I've just recently encountered, and I find its work really fascinating. It's an intersection in cultural studies between disability, queer, and critical race studies, where you're looking at obviously historically marginalized groups, but you're questioning how their experience is not something specific, but something that can be made universal, particularly during a crisis, right? And you're also using this approach to think about alternatives to living, right? So for instance, we are so desperate to continue to function the way we did pre-pandemic when it comes to education, when it comes to our day-to-day lives, when it comes to shopping, when it comes to our daily schedules. We're not thinking about how we can actually queer or how we can disturb this so that we evolve in a way that is countercultural, outside homogenizing norms of productivity, but it allows us to function far better in a far more holistic way when we are in a crisis, right? So first of all, a crip queer approach puts the onus on the state. So it counters neoliberalism completely. The onus is on the state to actually create policies that focus on the differential impact in terms of risk. So instead of blanket bans, right, like a full lockdown, you're kind of your policies are being decided on the basis of who is at high risk, who is at low risk, right? Which communities, which neighborhoods, which groups. So it's a way in which you're actually looking at the specific context rather than at a homogeneous normal population that just needs to adapt. You're also going beyond visible signs of non-normativity. So obviously there's been a lot of backlash against it. We're not willing to concede that we are precarious, because when we think about precarity, we think about the other, we think about others, we don't think about ourselves. So you're also redefining debility as something that's a universal experience, where even the disabled, or what we think of people as being disabled or being queer, they are also a combination of able disabled rather than just being defined by their disability, right? So, or by a kind of medical or by a kind of pathological singularity. So this is a universal experience we all have. Like I wear glasses, for instance, and I had to undergo corrective surgery for it. So I was able disabled, right? Then you're rejecting the neoliberal model of individual struggle and achievement, and the fact that if you fail during this pandemic, if you're not productive, it's just your fault. Instead, you're calling for community level activism, particularly on digital platforms, because that is where we've all moved now. And you're trying to imagine a different mode of futurity that is inclusive as well as sustainable rather than exclusionary, and where these binaries continue to exist, right? So crip queer, if I just have to summarize, it becomes a kind of non-compliant stance, right? Where during a crisis, traditional forms of ability, traditional definitions of ability and productivity are not adequate. They're not even accurate, right? So we need other forms of embodiment as a kind of positive metaphor. And social media feminism has been great in this regard, actually. So here are just a few examples I thought we can focus on towards the end of my lecture. Over the last couple of months, there have been multiple female or female identifying artists on Instagram, and I'll be focusing on Instagram just for the sake of time, who have responded to, let's say, Black Lives Matter, who have taken on a lot of digital activism, because now street protests and activism, street level activism becomes very, very difficult, or activism in the media becomes something particularly monitored and surveillanced by the state, right? So it's very interesting how many of these social media artists are trending, because they are pushing against this neoliberal myth of productivity and talking instead about precarity as being something positive, where you recognize your vulnerability, you are far more self-reflexive, you're far more at home with your body. And over here, of course, I'm talking about Rupi Kaur. Many of you may have actually been following her work on Instagram, and she's an Indo-Canadian artist and poet who recently took out a book called Homebody, which is poetry that is just based on the experience of lockdown, on the experience of being at home during the pandemic, on women facing domestic violence, on women experiencing mental anxiety, PTSD, and it's all in a poetic form where the home and the body become extensions of each other, right? So your home becomes an embodied space rather than just a territory that we are forced to occupy right now. So she's obviously, her book is trending, her push against this neoliberal myth of productivity is trending. She's done extensive live webinars that are free, that are captioned, where she talks about the process, where she took the longest time to write this book, ironically, because she was at home. And so it's when she talks about the process of her poetry, particularly of this book, Homebody, she says that the book is something that really came out of this anguish, this anxiety of being someone when you're at home without having to show something for it, right? Without having to prove that you accomplished or did something. So it's a very interesting kind of feminist and political gesture against productivity, where the body and the experiences of the present moment and experiences of precarity are something that are emphasized, something that are narrativized and archived. Similarly, another artist who's trending is an Australian queer artist who is Frances Cannon. Again, a wonderful account to follow on Instagram. So you can see all the comments, right, of her work. And this is from May 29, when most countries were in lockdown. So you can see that she has a very minimalist kind of monochromatic aesthetic, where she's again kind of creating this space where women's bodies are allowed to be exactly as they are, rather than performing, their gender. So you can see the body of women in their natural state with their body hair, a woman who has obviously undergone mastectomy surgery, right? So again, various levels and degrees of ability, normativity, precarity, right? So you can see a disabled woman, you can see a trans woman. So her work has also been trending a lot, particularly during the pandemic, and she's one of the case studies that I'll focus on after this. Of course, the other side to this, yes, there's yet another one. I think her name is Khushi. She's a she's a disabled activist who talks about, fashion for disabled women. And she has a lot a lot of webinars and blogs that she has done during the pandemic on Instagram, where she talks about how, there are ways in which you can continue to sort of exist without being productive, without being hyper-productive, without appearing to be, using every nanosecond of your life in a productive kind of way. So she has some very interesting, inspiring sort of quotations and live casts that she does, where she's talking directly, and she's talking in Hindi, which I find very important and very interesting. So her audience on Instagram is completely different. Her followers are a completely different kind of demographic. So she's another very interesting sort of Instagram account to follow. Of course, conversely, you have certain social media feminist artists and poets and activists who are being trolled constantly during the pandemic, because they're doing the same thing. They're busting this neoliberal myth of self-reliance and productivity, but because they are taking a crip queer approach, which is a very sort of illegible, or, and I don't mean that in a negative way, I just mean like there's no language for it yet. It's disorienting, it's very subversive. They get trolled, in very, very normative kind of ways. So one very good example of this is Alok Menon. Some of you may know of Alok Menon, maybe following Alok Menon on Instagram. This is again a diasporic trans activist, lives in New York, I think. And during the pandemic did some very brilliant self-portraits and photographs, where fashion became a way to deal with the mental anxiety of having to stay at home. And lots of interesting webcasts and podcasts about how to be trans in a private space like the home rather than public, where again, you're always expected to produce your identity in some way or the other, right? But of course, they get trolled constantly. There are lots of very dismissive, abusive, heteronormative slurs and racial slurs that are used to kind of shame Alok. And so again, it's very interesting how their work subverts a lot of expectations of normalcy and ability and productivity. And again, an Indian-based artist, Priyanka Paul, very young, actually. I think she's only about 20 or 21, so very much in the same age group as the students we were looking at who have unfortunately died by suicide, gets trolled constantly. Her account is called Art Whoring, and she's always being accused of being a failure that's something that I find really interesting, because all the art that she does, it's extremely subversive. It pushes against upper caste, upper class, neoliberal myths of the body and of productivity. So she's constantly trolled, and she's called, she's often called disabled, for instance, in a very negative kind of way, mentally disabled or physically disabled or ugly or non-woman because she's ugly. So these are a few case studies that I can quickly look at, and then I'll stop talking and we can open it up to discussion. So just to go in a bit of detail and give you all an idea, this is some work that Scinces-Pilani has done, which has again been received really, really well. So these have been, images that have been trending during the pandemic that are obviously pushing against productivity. So you can see this image. It's extremely surrealist. Of course, it's centered on the experience of the female body disintegrating during, through PTSD during the pandemic. And here you have, the days of lockdown being counted. And obviously she's saying, I'm fine, thanks, how are you? So how we appear to be productive and normal, to public, because these public perceptions are very important. And then, of course, you have this anatomy of myself in 2020, where there is a greater degree of gratitude and acceptance when it comes to mental health, when it comes to your role. So less phone time, making time for creativity, sex and gender positivity, loving my body without conditions, prioritizing rest, less consumerism, more generosity. Again, that's obviously a very strong attack against neoliberal principles. Taking part in politics, putting my needs first, empathy for others, nourishing my body, taking care of my mental health. Again, very interesting ways in which feminist digital activists have kind of taken on this myth of productivity. Of course, the counterpoint to that is this, the way in which Priyanka has been trolled, particularly during, some art that she put up that was protesting against NRC and CAA, and protesting against many diasporic Indian women who were actually spouting a lot of Hindutva ideology and upper caste Hindutva ideology. So you can see that, when trolls kind of represent her, this is obviously a right-wing kind of account. You can see that they've sort of taken a profile picture of Priyanka out of its context and put it on an ad of autism. Sorry about that. Put it on an ad of autism, kind of implying that she's mentally disabled. Again, it's very interesting how these signifiers are being used to sort of think about precarity in negative terms versus productivity as being normal. Again, you have a lot of caste slurs here. I'm sorry if some of this material is triggering, but this is the reality that these social media feminist activists are living with, pushing against. So when they push against these myths of productivity and heteronormativity and ability and ableism, often, it's both sides of the same coin, and a lot of symbolic violence is, shared and kind of exchanged in this interaction. So I'm tired of talking, so maybe I'll stop here. And we have a lot of material to go over, and we're really happy to take any questions or comments from the audience. If you'd like me to moderate, I can do that. Or anyway, so thank you. I'm just going to stop here. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. If I may call you Anhiti.
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Anhiti, for this fascinating lecture or fascinating talk on, because you had really, you talked about certain things which we have been thinking about all through, but never could really introspect as deeply as you did. And the issues that you talked about, like from precarity and productivity, these are issues that all of us have been grappling with, like day in and day out, and like kind of, and also productivity as something as a redefined phenomenon throughout the lockdown, and also kind of productivity as short term and long term. You haven't used the words, but if I can sort of whatever I could get up, or productivity has been tangible, productivity intangible. Always, the females always have been at the receiving end of these expectations.
Right.
So with this, I'd like to invite Dr. Amitabh Chakraborty, Associate Professor from the Department of Modern Indian Languages and Literary Studies, University of Delhi. He shall be the discussant of this evening. And may I request Amitabh sir to please share your views on Anhiti's talk, and subsequently may I also request all the participants to please type in their questions and observations. So I shall be taking them up one by one after Professor Chakraborty has done with his observations. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dhruv, and thank you, Anhiti, for such an engaging discussion. And I must tell you and all the audience also that I am already suffering from productivity tension.
Productivity, guilt, productivity, anxiety. These are our diagnosable things. Yes.
Yeah. Interestingly, my first discussion on pandemic was in a webinar where it was productivity during a pandemic, and I tried to look into cultural material which were being produced. So I'll come to that. I don't have much comment upon your presentation because I'm not an expert in that field. But I would like to add a few points which I was thinking and jotting down when you were conceptualizing. And a few, I think, would come from two positions. One is the advantage that I have of witnessing. We started archiving social media responses to pandemic back in March itself.
Right.
So I have been able to see a lot of memes, etc., which of course everyone has, but we started having a dedicated archive. And secondly, more and more, this might be an idealist position. I found this time, because of the existence of social media, there has been an aesthetization of the disease or the crisis in a way which we have not seen in earlier pandemics. For example, apart from Boccaccio, who aesthetized quarantine, Shakespeare, we don't really know why he didn't as much, except while he used in metaphors, etc. Particularly King Lear, I mean, he experienced plague, but we don't see plague being a central theme in any of his data. Apart from that, whatever cultural representation or artistic adaptations of earlier pandemics we have seen are actually from time we have been actually negotiating and representing. We always were negotiating in earlier pandemics also, but representing so much or producing so much about the crisis is unique in our human history. However, so I would be adding a few comments, which I think will lead us to think a bit more about what you are proposing. You see, when it comes to precarity, I would like to think that from Butler's writing to that collection that came out in 2016 of the Journal of the Association of Cultural Anthropology, which was curated, they curated it from their past issues of their journal. They put together, the theme was precarity. And I think that is a very important shift in understanding precarity. If we look at that, there will be a few, I see two matrices. One is which deals with short-term precarity, that feeling of precarity, right? Like Kathleen Stewart's worked on her ethnographic experience of how her mother went through after her father's death. Or say, when Haider al-Muhammad talked about that family which experienced the kidnapping of their son and how they went through it. And on the other point of that matrix would be Catherine Miller's work on, she worked on the recyclers, Rio garbage dump workers. And she found that though it was an unsettled, unorganized in that sense, work experience, that also gave them some relative autonomy. And because unlike the other first two papers, this paper deals with those who, for whose life this situation is not going to change. It's more interesting to see those who live in precarity for almost all their life, except the hope. In fact, the theorization of precarity at that level turns out to be how we deal with a life when we don't have that hope even. It's just like living it. But there, because it's talks about an experience which is a lifetime experience, how they deal with that. And the moment this author, Catherine Miller, is more important for me, I mean, of course, in the context of those other authors, because she deals with a long-term experience, and that's why she finds a very interesting thing that human beings are actually marked by how those recyclers actually adapted to that life. And there were moments when they enjoyed that relative autonomy they had. I mean, from the view of a settled life, it might seem that substance abuse and not respecting one's own life enough. But I think that's also a philosophization of the situation one has to live in. And I would dare say it's a aesthetization also of one's precarious life, where there is no, it's not like a tunnel where there would be a hope at the end. Now, coming with that, if I come to the material that you have dealt with, I think the material you have dealt with is primarily, and also your interpretation is primarily looking at disadvantaged groups and how they express that. In this expression, I would like to add positivity. Now, there are two types of positivity. One is that you have talked about, like community level activism. This is the first time we have been quarantined, and at the same time we have been together. This creation, because precarity's theorization, also one of the most fundamental aspect of it was that we feel that we have lost the network through which we sustain ourselves. Now, interestingly, when you come to this pandemic experience, what we find is that first, we have used the available technological and embedded and non-embedded cultural capitals. I mean, Bourdieu is one of my most favorite theoreticians, so I loved it when again, after a long time I heard about Bourdieu, someone using Bourdieu again. So with this both capital, we created that network to go beyond this feeling. But at this point comes the economic class base. So we have those who have this experience during this pandemic can be broadly divided in two sections. I mean, I think society is already divided in only two sections. So those who have various levels of entitlement, they have been doing two things. One, they were producing material where first they are talking of community activism, and second, they were aesthetizing the crisis. These aesthetizations are not always only into activism. For example, I saw so many memes where women celebrated the freedom of not being pushed to have makeup, or the freedom that webinars give human beings to present themselves in public, in a mix of public private, in dressing, in how we choose to create our background. Just before this webinar, I thought I should remove those jackets, etc. And then I thought, okay, if we are going to talk about precarity, I think I should keep those. So, and this is, in memes also, this has been represented. This is one point. Second point, we have found so many memes about the non-use of garments, undergarments. Bras, which are being used as tubs, flower tubs. Or they say comments like, after 3 months, I felt like I'm bound somehow. Oh, then I found, oh, I'm wearing bra after 3 months. Now, these are aesthetizations of a crisis where human beings are finding new ways, one, to communicate, and second, to make the crisis into a positive experience. But my positive is not that Sanskar TV positive, of course. But the point is, we are dealing with precarity through aesthetizing it. And I want to add that because what you have presented, and that goes with your framework, how disadvantaged groups try to deal with it. And the examples that you have shown, I would like to add that these individuals who created those were actually aesthetizing a crisis. This is first point. But the moment we come to those who don't have this entitlement, two suicide cases are very interesting for me. Unfortunately, I'm using the word interesting because we have already dehumanized that, by the way, sorry. So one is that the Delhi LSS student. Hers was an economic disentitlement which led to her suicide. Then there is another one who, there are two authors who are working on teachers' role during pandemic in our larger project. And when I had a meeting with them, the teacher who was more senior was talking about the suicide of one of her students. She said that, if only she could meet us, because she could not tell us everything over phone, if only she could meet us. So it was not economic disentitlement, it was about getting a psychologically safe space. Unfortunately for Indians, it is usually the educational institutions where they can talk to someone without feeling to be judged. So the division is of two types. One, who are have-nots, both in terms of economic entitlement and also having those cushions which provide us a sort of relief during psychological crisis. Because that girl's crisis was totally about, actually about her relationship. Now, neither of them were able to aesthetize it. I won't really go into saying even those were activism. And then if we include migrant workers there, if we include those who are, street children, those whose life depended on everyday earning as street vendors, etc. And then the other group, the group about which we are talking, because we also belong to that group. And in that group, it's important that we notice that that group is not only protesting, as Anhiti has underlined, I'm sure she has other material also. With that protesting and that arguing for a particular group, I think we need to add how this group has also aesthetized and experienced and may turn also became digital activists. And in this way, they try to deal with the trauma. Now, here comes another interesting thing. The question would be, did they feel productive when they were doing that? Because for that lecture, when I was searching, I found that in the beginning, in the first week of pandemic, there was a list of how you can remain productive during pandemic. They didn't include creating memes, right? So the point is, those who choose not to follow those guidelines of being productive, like exercising more, helping in housework. Of course, I think those whoever wrote that guideline was a man who thought that it's when a man works in household chores, it's always helping, not working. But what I'm trying to understand is those who during pandemic took up activism, I'm sure they felt productive. But those who just aesthetized, was that a feeling of productiveness, or was it enjoying? Should I say enjoying? I put it within quote. The precariousness that was short-lived out. Of course, I won't forget to mention that this happened only because they knew it was short-term. They had that entitlement to feel it was short-term. But I think at that point, they actually also, by just aestheticizing, so we have to differentiate between these two types of meme here. One which are activist memes, though aesthetization, but those which are not activist memes, those who did those non-activist memes were also posing a counterculture to this push of productivity. That's how I felt while listening to you, and also when I thought of precariousness. So these actually, Anhiti, I think if, I mean, okay, if Butler, 2009 and around that, then 2016 collection, particularly Catherine Miller's article, which was originally published in 2012, and then today, if we can conceptualize this, both of this, I mean, aesthetization and also activity related memes, perhaps we can actually see that what Catherine Miller understood while she was working on that garbage dump, and those who work with that, and found that life took its, I mean, they also created life. Perhaps we will reach another point where I'll push it to, because whenever we talk about the productivity versus precarity, we usually take side, and we usually almost there's a tone of sympathization or activism, right? I think those memes which only aesthetize perhaps open up a space where it is a celebration of that. I don't know. I'll be afraid I'll sound almost like postmodernists. But perhaps that's an important point. So that's all. Really, thank you. I mean, you have offered us a very framed and insightful understanding. And now I pass it over to our convener, Dhurjit.
Thank you, sir, Amitabh sir, for your comments. Okay, so Anhiti, would you like to respond to Amitabh sir? Because there are a few questions and observations in the chat box. I shall read them out. But before doing that, would you like to respond to Dr. Chakraborty's comments? And then we can
Yeah,
go to the chat box.
yeah. Um, no, thank you, Amitav. I think that you put so many of my points a little better than I could because I was bogged down by all the theory that I was trying to convey. Your point about the difference between activism and aestheticization is really interesting, and I think if I could just add to that, I would just say that I mean this notion of aestheticizing it has two parallel cultural trajectories. One is both of which actually come from certain parts of ancient Western culture. One is a kind of Greek tradition, one is a Latin tradition. And that's important because we are looking at all these residual ideas today, particularly because we've had this colonization as well. See, if you're going to think about aestheticization as a way in which you find a very individualized, original, creative, craft-oriented, productive experience of a crisis, right? So you put the memes there, you can put the bra burning, the kind of second wave of bra burning there. I mean, obviously that belongs to a tradition coming out of the Roman part of Western culture, the Latin part, where aesthetics is thought of as something that you make money out of. It's a trade. It's something commodified. So it's aesthetics as artisanal, aesthetics as technique, aesthetics as ars poetica, ars erotica, if I can call it ars corona, how to do corona, how to make money out of corona. So this is a very strong part of aesthetics where whatever content you're creating, it's absolutely linked to productivity and to all this like notion of if you're productive, you are having a positive experience of this crisis, you are maybe making money out of this crisis. So ordinary day-to-day things become something that are commodifiable. And that's completely part of this very Latin concept of aesthetics, right? Where you have the weaver, the craftsman, there's art, but there's also money and trade attached to it. And it's a neoliberal ideal. It's something that Weber and all of these people call the work ethic, right? Aesthetics is a big part of the work ethic. You can call it the work ethic, the work aesthetic, whatever. The other side is the Greek part, aesthetikos, which just means beauty. It just means pleasure. And I really think that this distinction that you've created, particularly through marginalized groups who have a very complicated relationship, not only to money and to monetization, but to pleasure and to beauty in our culture, right? I mean, they found a way through activism, through using the very same medium, social media, which is obviously a neoliberal medium, they found a very interesting way to reclaim and redefine notions of pleasure and being just by being at home, because this is often something, like you said, it's a long-term experience for them. It's not something temporary, something that we have to deal with as if we are in a game and, suddenly the game will finish and then we'll be back to our normal productive lives. So I think that in both cases, they are aesthetic. They are just aesthetic with a slight difference. One is far more attuned to our or to what I can call a non-Western kind of idea of aesthetics, where it's for its own sake, where it's a condition that gives us pleasure, and it's not necessarily pleasure in a productive or positive or identity-oriented sense. It's something that you feel. But with the other sense, it's something that you sell. It's something that you display. It's something that becomes a part of your identity as an artisan. So that's just a small kind of footnote I wanted to add to your comment, which I think it's really great. And thank you. Yeah.
Right. This is a very important point. Right.
Okay, thank you. So I guess we can now move to the questions from the participants. There are a few, and I'll take them as and when they are coming. All right, so there's one from Shreya Pandey, and she says, "Ma'am, it's an honor to participate and learn from such an erudite discussion. My brief observation, which might stand corrected, is that digital activism in context of feminism has also rent the veil from proclivity to preclusion, as the I of individual obliged to precarity is purblind. Hence, putting at pulpit the idea of agency, which has been perilously subdued due to burgeoning parley of consumerist subject identity in public platforms." So you can respond to that, and I'll move to the next observation.
I mean, hats off to you that you could read this. There's a lot of vocabulary here that's making me feel
Yeah,
precarious right now. So
yeah, I
hats off
understand.
to Shreya. I mean, how do you write like that? That's amazing. I don't really have, I think it's a good point. I mean, in a very kind of media studies kind of way, right? I mean, what is perceived is the identity right now because our bodies are missing. It's not there. Often when I do a Zoom webinar, I'm asked if this bookshelf is real, if I am real, because now you have all these digital wallpapers and backgrounds that hide your precarious existence, like Amita was mentioning. So absolutely, this way in which the I and the subject as something to be called out through what is perceived, right? And it's such a burden, it's such a pressure to kind of resemble the normal, the normative, that anytime you are being kind of disadvantaged or feeling precarious, it's an experience you just invalidate. It invalidates your identity, even though it is your identity. So it's a great point. That's exactly why I was saying that the notion of debility, the notion of queer, the notion of crip, it's become far more universal now because of the pandemic. It's become something we have greater empathy for rather than thinking about it as a particular experience of people who look like that or are like that. You know, this is what we all are right now. So I mean, I don't have much else to respond to that. I think it's a great point and extremely well worded. Wow.
Okay, all right. So then there's an observation from Anamika, and it's not a question, but she is appreciative of the talk, and she talks and she raises the point on like how the talk was a kind of an eye opener, and it sort of sensitizes one to the facts and engaging oneself in the multitasking productivity, anxious being the whole. I guess is hinting at the whole idea of multitasking and anxiety that it brings about.
Right.
So this is one. So you may like to talk about it, about
No, thank you, Anamika.
multitask.
I'm
Okay,
glad.
all right.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, okay, all right. Then there's a question. This is an observation from Akash, and there's a question actually. So I'm glad to be part of this presentation. Very informative, and most importantly, I got to realize about productive guilt that I guess we all of us are unconsciously bearing these days. And also, I found it interesting to learn about precarity, that it is ideological, something which is created, not given. But how was it that to deal with COVID situation, government agencies willingly used the help of the precarious identities? For example, I remember watching clips on the Quint and other social media news channels showing the sex workers and trans people are distributing food, taking part in helping out people. So how do you look at it? This is from Akash.
Yeah, that's a great question. So once more, I think my talk was trying to expand how we think about precarity, not as being restricted to certain individuals, but a condition we can all fall into, in neoliberalism, and a condition that remains concealed under the myth of productivity, a condition that we don't acknowledge. So I don't see any disjunct at all between the government calling upon women and sex workers and Dalit activists to kind of do all this distribution, because it follows that model of self-reliance. It follows that model of Atmanirbharta. It's a way in which there is this shame attached to not being productive, right? So I also think that with what we previously considered to be disadvantaged sections of precarious identities, they've had a very long and sustained experience of precarity. So for them, a pandemic is not very different in terms of financial deprivation or isolation or homelessness. I mean, it's not very different. It's because the pandemic has actually brought more people into precarity, and so the people who were already precarious remain precarious, right? So for them, there is a continuity, whereas for us, it's chaos. It's a rupture, it's break, because various degrees of our privilege are falling apart. So I don't see any disjunct in that at all. In fact, I think if you've been precarious for longer than this particular situation, you do, like Amitav mentioned, have an ability to be positive in precarity, because it's a day-to-day condition. It's not something that you can sit and sulk or mope about anymore. So, I mean, it's not as if the government was picking and choosing. It's just that when it came to the distribution of resources, these were communities who were used to being on the streets, who were used to kind of working on hands, right? Or hands-on or whatever. Whereas for the rest of us, ironically, now we're trapped at home, but when did we ever leave our home? Our home is a kind of safe space. It's a kind of sanctum that we can return to. And our engagement with the public, with welfare, it's deeply limited to maybe contributing some money to a charity online or whatever, right? There's a great amount of distance there. So it's not as if the government picked and chose precarious groups who, as if they were, to kind of do all this work for them. It's just that these were the people who have a sense of agency or an autonomy or kind of way of being precarious that allows them to empathize and understand a situation that for us is very new. So, I mean, that's a great question, but it's really a testimony of how precarity is really universal. I mean, so we are in that position now. They are in our position. That hierarchy that when we think of as sex workers or trans people or homeless people or Dalit activists as being the other, as being different. I mean, now their condition is our condition, and we are obviously pushing against it by being productive, because we don't want to give up this myth that we have that, we are privileged, we are able, we are different. So obviously productivity in this kind of situation is only going to lead to anxiety, because it doesn't lead to anything.
Okay, there's one more question from Abhishek. This question is, do you think this understanding of precarity can be used to raise awareness regarding the environment and different kinds of climatic crisis, which we also witnessed during the pandemic, where the community is more involved, taking steps for a sustainable future?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's precisely what I think the crip queer approach does. What I can do at the end of the session is share some resources, if you'd like to note them down, some books I read and some essays, because they're all oriented in this direction. That previously, when we thought of the environmental crisis, it was this thing that would happen way in the future. It's dystopian. At least it's not happening right now. And now you have a pandemic that has really made these, the fragility of neoliberalism and its effects so evident that, you can't ignore it anymore. And obviously being productive in that traditional kind of way, where productivity just implies conformity, individual aspiration and growth versus the growth of the community or the sustainability of resources, it's all fallen apart, right? It's meaningless. So a crip queer approach, in fact, is oriented in that direction, where they're thinking about combining ecofeminism with crip queer feminism and various kinds of these push against what is called neoliberalism, right? So it's been really good in creating awareness for other kinds of catastrophes that are obviously around the corner, right? They're not as far off in the future as we thought they are, because we have now experienced a precarity, like those of us who probably never faced food shortage, in early April and May, right? Or water shortage or air pollution. So these are things money cannot save you, or these are things that neoliberal kind of aspiration cannot get you out of. And this is not something individuals can fix. It has to be done through state policies. It has to be done through community level activism. When, for instance, during lockdown, we didn't have, at least for several weeks in this building, we didn't have waste collection happening. So obviously that allowed us to think about how are we just, mindlessly disposing of our waste as a group, right? If it doesn't have a place to go, then what do we do with it? So in our building, then we started to think about composting and separating, segregating waste. It's a very small gesture, but it really shows you that if you don't have all this like structure in place, where the individual's responsibility is something that, doesn't really matter, you're not thinking about community, you're not thinking about activism. This is the first time that, you're precarious because your waste is not being collected. You're precarious because you have to hoard food. You're precarious because Americans, for instance, middle-class Americans who are non-immigrants, they've never been precarious, and they had to scramble to get toilet paper and bread, which I think has such beautiful French Revolution connotations there, right? I mean, it's really interesting. So absolutely. I mean, even when it comes to the shift to, let's say, re-wearable, washable masks, because we were creating so much COVID waste, right, in the first couple of months of the pandemic. So it's been really helpful. And that's where the Crip Queer approach is oriented. It's about imagining a different future where we don't have all these divides based on what you're able to purchase, what you're able to do, because these are the two things that define your identity in a neoliberal culture. But on the other hand, you're thinking about yourself as just being part of an ecosystem that requires you to survive, that you require to survive. So what are you doing for the larger cause rather than for personal productivity or whatever, right? So that's again, a really good question. I think all this is definitely headed towards a more sustainable future. And when you come out of this trap of being productive in a very Sisyphus kind of way, right, in your own home, then you begin to push that productivity towards change and radicalism. So absolutely, yeah.
Okay, there's another question from Madhubendra. I guess you have more or less answered that. And his question is, do you think quote unquote patriarchy in any way has exercised control on how women express pre-pandemic or during the pandemic, precisely on social media? So we have more or less touched upon it. So, or would you like to say something more about it?
Not really. I just think that women have been particular victims of this productivity burden. So that's precisely what I was saying. So when we've had certain feminist activists on social media who push against it, it's not just about how what they're expressing. It's also about the way they're expressing has changed, it's evolved, it's adapted. Their voices are also being heard at a far more increased capacity in terms of followers, because previously what they were saying didn't have a reality corresponding to it, didn't have an empathy that could be created through the virtual platform, right? So I feel like even as, of course, these patriarchal norms and expectations have come down really hard on middle-class Indian women, on working-class Indian women. I also think that they have embodied ways to resist, ways to kind of protest against productivity anxiety, something that, again, it's very difficult for privileged men to let go of, because productivity is also a way in which their identity gets created, right? Their jobs are their identity, their disengagement from the home is their identity. So it's really interesting how women's bodies and trans bodies and queer bodies and disabled bodies have become a metaphor for all our bodies in a way. And I don't mean to generalize, of course. All I'm saying is that this kind of embodiment of precarity has changed the way in which we perceive patriarchal control, and we also perceive feminist pushback, right? So that's just all I have to add. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. All right. So, okay. So may I request if anybody who's not willing to type in but may like to sort of speak directly to Anhiti may quickly unmute themselves and have a brief question if anybody is interested to do that. Okay, Saheb.
Yeah.
All right, please.
Thank you, Dhurjyoti sir. Sir, yeah, there's a question or a comment. I can't categorize it fully, but I think when you say that a body is a home and a home is a body, and both of them are extensions of each other, I think I would strongly now disagree with it, because the idea of precarity now makes me feel that my body cannot be a home.
Mm-hmm.
It cannot be a place I am relaxing within my body, because precarity of all sorts, uh, that has been an ideological imposition, because there's a deliberation, and the pressure, the urgency of making everything socially relevant,
Mm-hmm.
whether I am behind a certain camera or I'm putting off my camera, wherever I am right now, within the virtual reality or in the real picture of existence, I'm always precarious.
Mm-hmm. That's
I
beautifully
can't
put,
be
Saheb. Yeah.
home. I
Mm-hmm.
can't be home. My home is not my home. And the
Mm-hmm.
deliberations, the stately deliberations, uh, the functioning, nothing makes me feel at home. And there's another precarity I would specifically want to mention, that the newness of staying at home, however strange it may be, however unwanted it may be, gave us precarity. That's understood. Now, in 2021, somehow we know that we'll be out on streets.
Mm-hmm. And
Right?
some already are, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it's, yes.
Even there's some negligence on their part, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe they have no other option but to be on
Mm-hmm.
street.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that gives us another kind of fear, because I mean, I was visiting a place like few days ago, and I was feeling that I was on the main road, and I was feeling that these flyovers may fall on me now. The huge traffic is like I'm not conditioned to face it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So these kind of things make me feel like I should stay hidden. I should stay
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
indoors, because this is my new reality now. However virtual it may be, I'm growing comfortable with it gradually. So how do you respond to that?
Um, See, Sahib, it's beautifully put. But again, I will push a little bit against um, just thinking about the pandemic in an emotional kind of way, which is, of course, important. Rather, taking that emotion in the direction of something we are all experiencing without recognizing its precarity, right? I mean, I've had so many students, A, who do not have access to technology, nor have they been given welfare or any scholarships from their universities or any subsidies in terms of their tuition. But B, like you mentioned, they are neither at home indoors nor are they home outdoors. They were not at home in their hostels. It's literally a refugee kind of state.
Right.
So I completely agree with you. I just think that why we need to talk about productivity in neoliberal terms, in very, very critical terms, let me put it that way, is because productivity represents hope in this kind of situation. It's a repression, it's a denial,
Right.
okay, this is how I'm feeling. Obviously, I'm not feeling at home in my home because I'm trapped here. It's like a prison. I'm not at home outside because I've become desensitized to the outside environment now. I have no idea how to deal with it. But if I'm productive, if this is the list of things that I did, if these are the talks I gave, if these are the pants I put on today, whatever, then all that goes away. Now, the trouble with that is it's so emotional. It's an individual level of guilt and anxiety and turmoil in a very
Right.
Freudian kind of way, right? Where everybody is even talking about the I and the I. So
Right.
even your social media self becomes a reflection both of that comfort and that discomfort, what you choose to reveal and what you hide. However, when you take a crip queer approach, like I have, you begin to realize that these emotions are not something that alienate you, nor indicate a sense of failure, right? This disjunct that you have with your home and the body, but it allies you. And I'm using the word ally deliberately. It allies you to people who have lived like that all their lives, right? So
Right.
there's a lot of scope there for a kind of radicalism. Whether it leads to something right away or not, it's a first step that the pandemic has definitely brought about, because the knee-jerk reaction to lockdown was, let's be productive, because we want to continue things as they were. We were productive once. We will continue to be productive so that when this temporary crisis ends, we will continue to be productive again when we have to come back to our offices and our universities and drive to work and, go to grocery stores. However, it now allows you to think that maybe I didn't want to be productive then. I don't want to be productive now. It's something I can't be. I don't think I ever was. That illusion around it and the fulfillment and worth that we feel collapses when you hear about suicides, when you hear about homelessness, when you hear about mental health, and when you hear about pre-TSD. And it's not something that is a statistic anymore. It's something you can absolutely relate to, right? It's a word for something you're actually experiencing. So this is the first time you feel like you have this precarity and this debility, which is not just a personal feeling or an emotion that you can write in your diary and it will go away.
Absolutely.
Because that's a very apolitical gesture. And that's what neoliberalism teaches you, to just carry on, right? I mean, deal with it. Just deal with it and move on. And if you can't, you're a failure. And it's not the state's responsibility. And it's not anybody else's responsibility. So I think that's why I'm pushing against. And I think there's great value in us coming out and saying all this, because before that, there was so much shame attached to saying these things, because you don't want to be accused of various levels of, what I can say, non-ableist behavior, right? I mean, we're always showing off our abilities. We're never really talking about our vulnerabilities, which is kind of, the lack of an ability or the opposite. So that's why I think when all these narratives come together, they are aestheticizing the disease. They are aestheticizing our, coping with the disease. They are aestheticizing it in a way that is actually really damaging to neoliberal state policies. So the expectation that once the vaccine is here and we're out on the street, no, we have all undergone this trauma. It will be like shell shock. It will be like what is called railway spine, where you just have no idea how to be normative again. And it's not something 2 or 3 people in the company or in the university are suffering and can be sent to a counseling center. It's all of us. But that's powerful. There's a lot of potential there, because it allows us to want desperately to change our reality rather than fool ourselves or deceive ourselves into thinking that this is what it is and I have to conform and be productive and perpetuate things the way they are.
True
Right?
that. Yeah. I completely get your point. And I think this individual precarity, which seems to be emotional, which seems to be personal, apolitical, but I think this is part of the collective consciousness altogether. And my precarity makes me feel the collective precarity.
Yes,
Yep.
precisely. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's never a question we used to ask before. It's not something that existed in this visible kind of way before. So social media has been very helpful. So if somebody, for instance, posts on social media, I'm having a hard time, 2 years back, I've seen people like posts like that. And I used to think, what are you doing? But now I've had people who actually write comments. This is my number, call me. I'm also having a hard time. So what I'm saying is it's actually become a platform where our disabilities are out there, right? In a very, very archivable kind of way, whereas previously it used to be a personal expression. It might even be a joke, right? Not something anybody took seriously.
True. Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you very much.
Amitabh sir, please.
Yeah, I have just taken permission from, I mean, this discussion is going to in a way which actually is like sort of giving, pushing us to ask a few more things. A few of these are questions, a few of these are just suggestions. I mean, I'm just thinking aloud. The first one is, Anhiti, the way you, in your second or third slide, had put conformity as a capital. I think this is not something which is discussed much. So maybe after that, you can expand a bit on that. Apart from that, I have a few comments again to add to your the discussion you had just with Saheb, and during that, a few things came to my mind. I was thinking when we are talking so much of productivity, etc., those who are dealing with masculinity studies, because if we go back to those two psychoanalysts, am I audible? Because my screen is.
You are audible, sir. Carry on. Please carry on. Please carry on, sir. We can hear you.
Okay. So Horney and Clara Thompson. Now we know that Clara Thompson started to argue or tried to argue that rather than giving importance to penis envy, we should give importance to womb envy that men suffered from. And hence they started actually having this patriarchic understanding where they divided the world in two. One where the woman has been pushed to because of that envy and the feeling of lack that they cannot recreate, they cannot procreate. So they thought that their fulfillment is at the social space. They were trying to feel that envy, feel that lack. Now, did this experience of being at home create any a different anxiety, or either in, and was it expressed in positive or negative way? I'm not sure, and I know that we are not discussing about that right now, but I just wanted to add to, because your discussion about productivity has led to this thought. The second point is when it comes to precarity. I was following your and Saheb's discussion. Do you think that this pandemic actually gave, precarity had always been that terrain of the not haves, right? Do you think that the fact that we are talking so much about it, that for the first time it has given the haves to even appropriate that, and because they have the haves, sort of they are taking away the political edge that the understanding of precarity had away. These are the two. I mean, I think one is a question, the other is a comment. Yeah. Anhiti, you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry. So the question about how conformity is normally not seen as a kind of ability is, it's a really good one. And over here, I don't just mean conformity like Butler talks about performativity, where all genders have to conform to this idealized norm of gender, and their failure to conform is actually something that it's precisely through these failures that they learn how to perform, right? I mean, over a period of time. I mean, it's a bit of that, but it's also conformity in the sense of when this pandemic became evident, and when lockdowns were announced all over the world, including our country, conformity became something that was coercive for the first time, whereas previously we never thought of it as being coercive. Like even with Butler, there's a lot of playfulness, a lot of postmodernism attached to gender performativity, with the example that she gives of drag and trans and, you know, choice. But of course, she's revised all that hence since then. But this is the first time that conformity was coercive in very, very political, but also in very, very private ways. So For instance, if you are a queer person in India, your identity has been very recently decriminalized and made somewhat normal, somewhat existable. But now with the pandemic, if you're not part of, let's say, an institution, right, that is a normative institution like the family or let's say marriage, right, then where do your desires go, for instance, right? So a lot of ethical backlash or moral censure was faced by queer sort of persons on social media because they put up posts saying that, okay, are we going to do Tinder and Grindr and all these things via Zoom now? I mean, where do we go, right? I mean, where do our desires go? So there was a very interesting way in which staying at home became another facet of policing their bodies, policing their presence, policing their access, right? And then, of course, when it comes to how you display your productivity on social media, there are norms there as well. You know, you can't put up a post that says, okay, these neighborhood children were making a lot of noise today, so I built a gate and a fence around my apartment, and this is how I was very, very productive. And you know, so there are all these, again, roles, idealized roles or norms of productivity that you have to conform to. So if you are putting up something on social media as an average person experiencing lockdown, then you have to kind of put up a recipe, you have to put up maybe fashion advice, you have to put up a webinar, something that is content oriented rather than something that is authentically to do with what you're experiencing. And this content is, again, very, very conformist. It's ultimately, immediately, like I said, you know, there are lists and ways of doing it. And very few of us questioned it. We kind of accepted that this is how we are going to let the world know that I'm not just lying on the couch scratching myself. I'm doing all these cool things. So it's very interesting how with queer and trans folk, their productivity, even if you might want to, you know, define it in literal terms as productive, it's not deemed productive because it's not conformist productive, right? So that brings me to your point about politics and about how one of the unfortunate sort of consequences of this universalization of precarity, just like you have the, you know, universalization of the proletariat, right? I mean, it's always something that's a bit taken with a pinch of salt by Marxists because that's not true at all, and that's not what's going on. And it's again a myth that neoliberal cultures in the West perpetuate. I completely agree with you that when that happens, there might be a way in which there is a very privileged kind of empathy that you display on social media where you say, oh, I'm like you now, I'm precarious. That also makes me really cool. So now you need to, be mindful of how you address me, and you need to be mindful of my trauma. And I am also a subject of trauma. So I agree that kind of, way in which precarity has now become this kind of apolitical state that we can enter and exit however we want. Again, that is one of the damaging consequences. But again, I mean, I feel like, see, what's happened is obviously a barrier or a border that existed between these identities, whether in terms of class or caste or gender or technological ability, physical ability, even politics. This barrier has broken. So there is going to be, a kind of a porous filtering on both ends, where obviously the cause for marginalized groups might get diluted, but their cause is also something that privileged groups are now beginning to finally pay attention to. So I feel like when that happens, that hybridization, you have to take the risk of not being a pure subaltern identity, perhaps. But it's the first time someone's listening to you. So you cannot hold on to your subalternity and insist that, okay, now, in a very South African apartheid kind of way, where it's like, okay, you're a white person, you cannot talk about my experience, or you're a man, you cannot talk about what I feel as a woman, or you're straight, you cannot talk about what I feel as a queer person, or you're abled, you cannot talk about what I feel as a disabled person. I feel like a conversation is finally happening that has scope for sustainability. And if it didn't, then we'll hold on to these labels for centuries, as has happened in the past, without any real progress being made. So I guess it's a risk that you have to take, where if your precarity becomes something that more people are sharing, naturally your experience is no longer singular, it's no longer subaltern. But that also means that there are more people who are willing to participate in your activism, because now they know that they are not as safe as they thought they were, nor are you as other to them as they thought they were. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I thought of only in one way, but okay, what you have added right now is very interesting. I thought in terms of appropriation, you thought in terms of dialogue. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Amitav sir. Thank you, Saheb and others for their comments. And thank you, Anhiti. So I guess it's almost 8 o'clock and we can wind up for the day now, I guess. So if there are no further questions and comments, then yeah, so let's call it a day. So thank you, Anhiti, for your very insightful lecture. It puts us in a position to talk about many more. This can go on actually, right? This can go on, and we can have, multiple levels of discussion on various issues of this kind. We can talk about our own stories and our friends' stories, and that's just so personal about these things which are at once personal as well as universal. Anyway, so
And
now
probably
may
if we weren't in a platform which is so timed and paid, that we would be having coffee or tea post a talk and carrying the discussion forward. But again, this is a privilege now. This is not something we can do. So it's really, again, it really shows how many limitations there are, even when we think we're free, right? We have free speech, we have free access. But thank you so much. It was really a great pleasure, a great opportunity.
Okay, so may I request Saheb to please propose the vote of thanks to bring about a formal end to this event. Over to you, Saheb.
Thank you. Where do I begin? Right, there's so much precarity, right? Uh, I'm grateful that we all could gather the courage and be a part of this webinar today. And my sincere thanks to Dr. Anhiti for accepting our invite, for her time, for her views, her research, analysis, and for putting it out in a way that it becomes convenient for all of us to engage with that. And in times such as these, I think this is the only academic negotiation, exchange, or maybe escape that we all need to keep ourselves going. So I think this was another enriching lecture, talk, whatever it may be, but it has given us so much. It has made us feel rich. Our faculties are like sustainable now for at least 2-3 days. So thank you very much, Dr. Anhiti, for your time and for enlightening us today. My thanks to Dr. Amitav for extending the discussion, where for giving us so much pointers to engage with one particular topic that has so much subcategories to it. Dr. Dvijati for convening the session so wonderfully. And thanks to all the participants for being so patient. And I hope that all of us, in whatever condition we are able to make the best of what we are able to fetch and we are able to get. So thanks for being part of this webinar. Thanks for all your questions, your concerns, your comments. And I really hope that we keep up the spirit of having more webinars such as these, and experts like you, Dr. Anhiti, we really need for our project. And I hope that our collective efforts are going in the right direction and we are able to, conceive the best and perceive the best out of it. So all the best to all of you. And thanks everyone for your time, for your energy, and for making our lives less precarious for at least these 2 hours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Saheb. It also gave me the opportunity to make slides out of things I've been rambling about for the last 7 months, to my family. So now it's all serious and validated, and I feel less precarious. So thank you to all of you for actually inviting me to do this.
Thank you,
This
everyone.
is honestly the first time I've been invited, rather than made an application with an abstract, to present a talk. So it's great, and I'm pretty sure it couldn't have happened without the pandemic. So we have some things that we need to thank, I guess, that have brought us together, and our ability to be here today, like you said, it's something that we shouldn't take for granted. It's something we should be grateful for, and it's so well put, Saib. So thank you so much. It's great for me.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for everything that you have done for us today. And thanks everyone for joining us. Over to you, Dr.
And
Jyoti.
thank you, Saheb. Thank you, Saheb, for for beginning and ending the session with so much of
Thank you.
flair and so much of
Oh, no, Dhruv, we must add that Saheb is the coordinator of our COVID archiving.
Yes. So her responsibility is like much wider, and this is something part of her actual job. So yeah, actually. So yeah, thank you, Saheb, for wonderfully sort of being a part of this program and sort of leading the way forward. So thank you everyone once again. And thank you, Anhiti.
It couldn't have been possible without like each of our effort,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah. It's a collective.
Yeah, it's a collective.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
So I'm ending the meeting. Thank you, Anhiti. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.